Welcome to the Holy Post. This week, Phil and I do a retrospective on 2021, which Phil dubs the year the Empire Struck Back. We recall some of the biggest stories and trends, and then we pontificate about what to expect in 2022. Then I'm joined by my friend David Kinnaman, the president of the Barna Group, to launch a new reoccurring segment on the podcast that we're calling Barna Briefs. Kinnaman reveals brand new research about the state of the church and alarming numbers about pastoral burnout. But before we start today, just a quick word of deep appreciation to all of you for making 2021 the biggest year of the Holy Post ever. Thank you for your support via Patreon and for sharing the show on social media and with your friends. We have some big plans for next year, which is our 10th anniversary, so stay tuned for some exciting announcements in the weeks ahead. Okay, here's episode 489.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. This is Phil Vischer. I am here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And that's it. Skye.
All the real serious kids showed up and everyone else is just on holiday.
It is, as we're recording, it's the 2 days after Christmas, Monday, the 27th of December. So we're in that week between Christmas and New Year's where all sane people have stopped working and gone to other places. And yet here I am and here Skye is for you guys to give you content. Because we know that your thirst for content is nigh unto insatiable. And so here we are.
Here we are. I have to do two podcasts today. That's how committed I am.
You are uber committed. What are you recording later today?
French Friday with David French, which I think we'll release on New Year's Eve.
Oh,
that's Friday.
Okay, so is it going to be alcohol themed for New Year's Eve?
I don't know David's alcohol preferences,
his point of view.
Yeah.
Or is it Omicron themed for not having any New Year's Eve fun?
Yeah, that could be. It's really been a downer this year.
It really has been a downer.
I was texting you earlier. I'm convinced 100% of people now have COVID. Everyone has it.
Yeah, everyone. Yeah. I was sick all last week, which may have been COVID. I don't know. A bunch of us were sick in our household because I have a grandson. Do you have a grandson, Skye?
I really hope not.
No? Okay. Well, maybe you'll get one of these days.
Someday,
maybe you'll get a grandson one of these days. I have a grandson. He's 2, and I pretty much decided he is a biological weapon because he gets runny noses all the time, and then he attacks you with virus. He just comes and says, Papa, here's how you're spending your next week. You're going to feel terrible. You're going to have the sniffles, and you're probably going to be in bed a couple of days. You're welcome. And then he toddles off. Like if you could have airdropped him, drop shipped him into a battleground, he could have taken out the whole German front just with sniffles.
It reminds me of a friend who, when his son was very little, probably about Micah's age, your grandson's age, came up to him very adoringly and said, "Kiss you?" because he wanted a kiss with his dad, but the boy had this completely snot-ridden, gross face, and the father was like, okay, I guess, he didn't want to deny this affectionate moment with the kid, so he gives him this slobbery kiss, and he's all probably infected with who knows what from that. And then the kid says again after the kiss you. He was actually asking for a tissue. He wasn't saying kiss you, so he got slobbered with gross stuff
for no good reason.
Mm-hmm.
All right, on that note, here's the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian.
So Skye and I wanted to go back. See, I'm still a little bit sick, Skye. Did you hear that? Did you hear me clear my throat?
I just assume you are, Phil.
I'm still a little bit sick, but it's okay. I don't have COVID we all do. Maybe we just all do, and that's just the way it is. We wanted to go take a little trip back through the last year to talk about, we need to give the year a theme and talk about some of the stories that were our favorites or the most notable or important for looking at the last year. And then we want to go forward and let's talk about next year, because I think Skye and I can probably predict with a high degree of accuracy what next year is going to be like.
Yeah, we're like the Nostradamus of the podcast world.
Yeah, yes. We are the Nostradamus. We,
Yes.
plural, are the singular. Which part of Nostradamus are you? And which part of Nostradamus am I?
I'll be the top half.
Okay.
You can be the butt.
I'll be the news of the Nostradamus butt. Okay, remember 2020? Skye, do you remember 2020?
I really try not to.
There was a year that was called 2020, and it was interesting. It was quite a year because it started the pandemic, but it also started a huge movement toward thinking and talking about racial justice. There was also, it was part of a movement toward thinking and talking openly about abuse in the church, and that, sexual abuse in the church was not, we all decided, I guess that's a Catholic thing, and that won't affect any of our institutions. That doesn't happen in Protestant institutions. And then was 2020 Ravi Zacharias? That was 2020, wasn't it?
I think so. Didn't he die in 2020?
Yeah,
and then all that stuff came out.
All the stuff came out, and then a bunch of other stuff, and the SBC came out with stuff, and so we said, at the beginning, before when we were innocently looking from 2019, we were innocently looking forward to 2020. Do you remember this moment? Looking forward to 2020 and saying, 2020, we're going to have perfect vision next year. We're going to be able to see clearly. And then it just turned into a poop show of a year. But it revealed a lot about us. And some people said in retrospect, that was kind of true. We did see 2020 was the year of seeing clearly, and we don't like what we saw.
In fact, I believe the first podcast we did in 2021, or maybe it was the last one of 2020, we had historian John Fia on to give us perspective on what we could learn from 2020. That was the idea. It's 2020 perspective. You look back, hindsight, all that.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and listen to that. That would be interesting. So we wanted to talk about some of our favorite stories from 2021 and how we kind of see the year playing out. So Skye, why don't you go first and give your general impression of what you found notable about 2021?
Okay, but you said favorite stories, and that's, I don't know if that's how we want to frame this.
No, okay,
right?
Not favorite stories, but most representative stories of the year, or most significant, or whatever you want to say about it, mister.
Right.
If you're watching this on YouTube, it looks like Skye is in a completely different location, and that's because someone painted his room. Apparently, while he was asleep, someone snuck into his office and painted it. And it went from being very light colored to being I thought it was black. It's like, Skye, you're in a black box with a, who painted that picture on the
Rembrandt?
That
would be Rembrandt.
Yes. Rembrandt's prodigal son is on the back wall. Other than that, he's in a black box, except he says it's dark blue.
It's dark blue. It doesn't come up on camera as dark blue, but it's dark blue. And the Rembrandt was a wedding gift from my brother. He gave me, it's the Return of the Prodigal Son.
Wedding gift? Wait, so did he know you were already particularly fond of that picture?
Yes.
When you got married?
Yes. And
that was a long time ago.
It was.
Rembrandt was still alive.
Almost 23 years ago. He found that very large, full-size print somewhere and had it framed, which was quite a nice wedding gift.
Wow.
Okay, so 2021 stories. We were texting about this earlier. Now I can't, for some reason, that text is not popping up. Didn't I share something with you about
Yes, you did.
Because I wrote what some of them were.
You lost your notes already. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I got it.
I just put it in the chat.
I found it.
Okay.
So there's a number of them. This is not like a favorite as in endorsement, but I think symbolic of what the year held for us was the debate, conversation around the sin of empathy, which emerged out of the Bethlehem Baptist mess. Some of the pastors and faculty of the school there resigned over accusations that they were too empathetic. And it kind of became a rallying cry or an interpretive framework for those who see what's going on in the culture right now around things like sexual abuse, #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, and feel like the culture is becoming overly empathetic and sensitive to those who have been marginalized or victimized by systemic
and the
abuse.
complaint, to try to frame the complaint charitably, it was defining the difference between sympathy and empathy. As sympathy, you feel for, you care about someone's situation. Empathy, you enter into their emotions about the situation and lose perspective. And so you can't stand back with any distance and say, potentially, I don't think you're looking at this correctly.
Yeah. So they frame it as when you become overly empathetic, you lose touch with truth, especially doctrinal truth, because you feel so much from the other person's point of view that you can no longer see objectively, which is another way of saying rational objectivity is always the right perspective to have. And that is an interesting assumption in and of itself.
Which also implies that it's possible.
Yes, exactly. Which is a very modern assumption that I am unbiased. I am just strictly based on the facts, doctrine, scripture interpretation, whatever it is, and my own emotional and cultural leanings have no bearing whatsoever on how I engage the world or God's truth.
And that pushback has come in multiple areas. For example, people saying there was a movement in 2020. I remember Beth Moore saying at one point that she realized she needed to, quote, decolonize her library, her theology library. So what Beth Moore was responding to was opening up her perspective to other points of view that came from other, cultural situations. So should we care about what an African theologian thinks when he reads Hebrews? Should we care about what a non-European, a South American theologian or just anyone from a different perspective, does that matter? Does it matter if your interpretation was written by a white male or a black female? Is there a difference? And is there an important difference? And people like Wayne Grudem and others pushed back on that and said, no. And I remember, what's his face, MacArthur, just said, we don't want black or white perspective. We want the right perspective.
Which happens to be his. Yeah.
Yeah. It was an interesting thing. So this kind of led me, that fits in with my theme. I gave the year 2021 a Star Wars movie title. Okay, because it seemed like it fit. So 2020 was these really interesting things going on with George Floyd, and you had Beth Moore reaching out to people from different backgrounds. You had Russell Moore. Did he hold that event on sex abuse and sex abuse survivors with Rachel Del Hollander? Was that in 2020?
I can look it up, but it may have been in 2021.
Yeah, it was either 20. Okay. So are you sure?
I don't know. We'll look it up.
Okay. Anyway, it was around there, but he started speaking up more and more. So the Me Too movement started coming to the Southern Baptist Convention with reports of abuse within Southern Baptist churches that had been covered up. And Russell Moore led the charge on that. And so there was this movement in 2020 of people saying, we have to be open to more perspectives. We have to hear more voices. We can't always assume that we, the majority, in this case, white men primarily, are the ones who know what's right about everything. So that was 2020. I describe 2021 as The Empire Strikes Back.
And at least you picked a good Star Wars movie. At least you didn't call it the Phantom Menace.
Not because it fits my theme, but simply because, and the reason is there was such a strong pushback on people like Beth Moore and Russell Moore, who now neither are in the Southern Baptist Convention. There was a pushback, I'll go into this later, there was a pushback on the Salvation Army, got whacked badly for trying to promote racial justice in curriculum to all its members. So there was this huge pushback. So let's talk about this one. Okay, Russell Moore. Yeah, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting that at the end of 2020, we had a presidential election in which Joe Biden won and Trump, after one term, lost.
But
and
did he?
Hold on.
Did he really?
But at the very beginning of 2021, January 6th, you had the insurrection, which was essentially the Empire Strikes Back, right? And those kind of fit the theme for both years, where 2020 was all about change and let's shift course and let's go a different direction. And 2021 comes in and says, hold my beer, watch this. We're not going anywhere.
2020 was a group of largely white conservative voices saying maybe we need to rethink our position in these conversations.
Or at least welcome more voices into the conversations.
Yes. And 2021 was a group of conservative white voices saying, not so fast.
Mm-hmm.
You are going too far or trying to fix things that we don't think are broken. So let's talk about the ERLC. Okay, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention was run by Russell Moore. Russell Moore was chosen, I forget how many years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago, to replace Richard Land, who was a very kind of right-wing, controversial culture warrior and had taken it in a very culture war direction. Russell Moore was chosen to be a kinder, gentler face of the SBC in ethics and religious liberty conversations. Russell Moore brought in conversations about race. He brought in He didn't move away from conversations about abortion and the traditional, kind of right-wing ethical concerns, which is pretty much abortion and religious liberty
and marriage.
So he didn't move away from those. He didn't say, he didn't endorse radically liberal positions or even change those positions. He just said, let's add these strands to this conversation. Let's bring in some conversation and let's listen to our African-American brothers and sisters. Let's listen to women who have been victims of abuse. So that led to an investigation of him and the ERLC, at one point an effort this year to shut down the ERLC because it had, quote, become a distraction to the work of the gospel, and ultimately led to Russell Moore leaving both the ERLC and the SBC. So now here's what I find interesting. Over the last couple of weeks, the ERLC interim leadership has sent out some emails to their email list, which somehow I'm on. Not sure why.
How you're seeing this stuff, because I haven't.
Yeah. But summarizing the year and the direction of the ERLC. And what the emphasis is on, do you know what they're emphasizing is the good work that the ERLC is currently doing?
If it's race and sexual abuse stuff, is that what they're still emphasizing?
No.
Oh,
no.
I thought, okay, don't. If Russell left for nothing, that would be terrible.
No. It emphasizes their work on pro-life causes and religious liberty.
There you go.
So there's zero mention of the Me Too movement, zero mention of abuse, zero mention of any race issues whatsoever. So have you seen that picture by the Detroit artist that was the whitewashing of history? And it's a composite painting of Black civil rights leaders. And then there's a white guy standing in front of it, literally rolling white across the painting.
Oh, no, I haven't.
And that's the painting. It's a painting of a painting being whitewashed. These historical Black figures.
Little on the nose.
It might be. Well, it's all over their whole faces. It's not just their nose. So it feels like what the ERLC needed to do was reconform to conservative political priorities, not conservative theological priorities, but conservative political priorities to reassure the donor base, the audience, the conservative churches within the SBC, basically saying, "Don't worry, we're back in line."
Well, don't you think this has nothing to do with theology? This has nothing to do with the mission of the gospel. It has nothing to do with the church. It has everything to do with the maintenance and the maintaining of established structures. It's institutional maintenance is what we're talking about here. And that's what's so frustrating is if there's one group of people who should be more concerned about their mission than their institutions. It should be gospel-oriented Christians. And yet, what we're seeing over and over and over again in this story and numerous others is that when it comes down to it, more often than not, it's the institutional considerations that end up carrying the day. And that's sad.
Yeah, so it is kind of interesting that, when Russell Moore was pushing for more conversation about race and about abuse, one of the complaints was these topics are distractions from the gospel.
Yep.
We need to get back to focusing on the gospel. And then the correction is, all right, back to abortion and religious liberty. Like, where?
Right.
So that's the gospel?
Okay, this sounds strange, but it reminds me of many, many years ago when I was a young pastor. My son Isaac was born in 2004 in December. He just had his birthday. He turned 17, and he was born prematurely, had lots of issues. We were in the hospital for months, tons of medical bills. And in the midst of all of that, our church decided to change our health insurance policy and give us much less coverage. Not just me, but like everyone on staff. And obviously I was a bit raw at the moment. I wasn't at a place where I wanted to be told you're going to have more medical bills.
Did you say things that you later regretted?
Not that I regretted, but I definitely let my feelings be known.
Did you step on toes?
I may have, but I did meet with one person who had some authority in this situation and asked for an explanation as to why this change was made. And the explanation I was told is that the less money the church has to give to health insurance, the more it can give toward the mission of the gospel.
Oh.
But in this person's mind, paying for the pastoral staff and their families, including health insurance, was not part of the mission of the gospel.
Right.
So it was justifiable to squeeze us on our health insurance because it's better for the gospel. And it all comes down to how you define terms and what you believe is included in the mission of the church. So I can see people making that argument in the SBC and doing it in all sincerity because they genuinely believe that helping victims of abuse and issues of racism and systemic racism are not within the purview of God's care or the gospel. They genuinely think that. Mm-hmm. And how do you argue with them if that's their definition? And I knew, like, when I had that conversation about health insurance, I knew I could get nowhere with this person because in their mind, these were just completely opposite categories.
But then can you turn around and say that religious liberty and abortion are the gospel?
I bet you could for some people.
Okay.
Yeah. Because religious liberty, I mean, it's religion. It's the right of the church to do its work.
It's the right to preach the gospel.
Right. So I'm not saying this is right. I'm just arguing. I understand how people have built these categories in their imaginations, the mental map they have of the world of what is gospel ministry and what isn't.
Right.
And if something falls outside of that, there's very little you can do to convince them that it should be included in it.
Yeah, it's. I have seen so many people define the word gospel in so many different ways based on primarily what they're arguing against. Mm-hmm. What you're doing should not be done because this is the gospel. Right. And here's my definition.
In fact, I'd say throughout history, we have tended to define the gospel in response to some heresy.
Yeah.
And this is what you see in the Middle Ages, right? There was a lot of nonsense going on in the medieval Roman Catholic Church, and along comes Luther and Calvin and others, and the way they tended to define the gospel was in juxtaposition to the Roman Catholic ideas, not necessarily on an objective reading of the New Testament. And so then you inherit that definition of the gospel, and you still have people arguing about it today, saying, well, substitutionary atonement, that's the gospel.
Yeah.
Well, that's because they were arguing that in the Middle Ages against the Roman Catholic false teachings at the time. And so we are always redefining it based on what heresy at the moment we're fighting against. And that's why today some people are arguing that complementarian views of men and women, or not going with an LGBT agenda, they incorporate all that into what is the gospel because they care about those issues and feel like the culture and the church is filled with false teaching. And to make this argument stronger, let's call it part of the gospel. And that's how you build onto these kind of weird doctrinal statements that we inherit.
Because the gospel is colorblind. So if you are having a conversation about race where you want to divide people up by the color of their skin and say some people have different needs or need more attention, that's anti-gospel.
Yeah, but it breaks down so easily, though. I think we would all agree that, I don't know, pick your horrible injustice. Can you think of one, Phil?
Yeah, children having to pick apart cell phones to pull out the recyclable precious metals,
Okay.
and cutting their tiny fingers.
I think we would all agree that that is not part of the gospel.
Which
However, the child labor, let's just call it.
Yes, child labor.
Child slave labor is not part of the gospel.
Yeah.
I'd agree. And yet, should Christians care about child slave labor?
No, it's a distraction from the gospel.
But if it were our children, we would all care about it.
All you have to do is when you turn your phone in for recycling, rubber band a copy of the 4 spiritual laws to your phone. Then the child will receive the gospel as he's receiving his daily work and small lacerations to his fingertips. And you'll have done everything Jesus has asked you to do.
No, anyway,
Skye.
we could have a whole
Skye.
episode here about defining the gospel, which we've
Yeah.
done in the past, but we use that as a bludgeon against our.
So Empire Strikes Back, Salvation Army version. Last year, there was a movement, 2020, of companies and large organizations, legacy organizations, saying, have we in fact been blind to racial justice issues? Let's re-examine, or let's hire a consultant, or let's read a book. Let's all read a book together. So the Salvation Army, I think, hired a consultant to say, have we been blind to issues of racism in our own history? And they came to the conclusion that yes, we have. Now let's create a curriculum to teach everyone to think about this differently, to think about issues of racial justice differently. And I remember probably 5 months ago, I saw a little story, and I actually flagged it for the podcast, but then I didn't end up talking about it because I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. But just a typical right-wing commentator, and I don't know if it was Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro or who it was, saying, look what the Salvation Army is doing. They've gone woke. And it was a woke alarm. Woke alarm, woke alarm, woke alarm. And I thought, wow, you can't, something has changed where we're now just hunting for anyone doing racial sensitivity training of any kind, and then pulling the alarm. And I wonder if anyone will notice, if this is going to cause any trouble for the Salvation Army, or if this is, hopefully it's so little that I don't even mention on the podcast. Well, it turned out that it spread so much, it significantly decreased giving to the Salvation Army this Christmas time, to the point where they had to retract the curriculum and just say, we're just not going to do it. So they're just not going to teach anyone about racial justice because, kind of the anti-woke, the woke mob. We've all heard about the woke mob coming for you. The anti-woke mob came before the Salvation Army and put them in a position where they had to back down on the mea culpa of, we've been a largely white-centric organization, since our founding, and we want to be aware of that.
Go ahead.
And I'm aware of other big companies that were in the midst of, well, let's initiate something to try to take this issue more seriously, and we'll listen to some of the voices of African-American activists and what they say about this. And then suddenly you get attacked so brutally for that, for even being, did you bring up a Kendi book in your church? Are you kidding me? And there was a whole closet industry of, the Vodi Bachums and the Neil Shenvis and others on the conservative right saying, there's nothing more dangerous to the gospel than critical race theory. Nothing is more dangerous to the gospel. That was a huge theme of the last year, is that critical race theory is destroying the gospel. And so anything associated with critical race theory is now an enemy of the gospel. So Salvation Army has to back down. We're not going to teach about racial justice. We're sorry. It was a terrible, I don't know if they apologized or they just tried to make it go away quietly. But then you had people called out, whether it's, Beth and Russell Moore, the power couple, or, New York guy, Tim Keller, who's like the least liberal. Yeah, he's just a old white Calvinist in New York City, but suddenly he's a hip wokester.
It's funny. I mean, you talk about that critical race theory has become this trigger for people and it's a woke alarm and all that, but it's actually not critical race theory anymore. It's just race.
Yeah.
It's just talking about race now sets off the alarms, which, okay, two things on that story. Number one, I find it really weird and ironic that the same people who are crying all the time about liberal cancel culture are themselves engaged in cancel culture all the time. I mean, that's what they tried.
It's only cancel culture if the other side does it. I've said
Right.
this before. I'll say it again. If
And
my side does it, it doesn't count.
Right, because that's this classic fundamentalism. But here's the other thing, the broader thing that I think 2021 epitomizes now is it feels like the entire world is being sorted. We've talked about the big sort before, where people are self-selecting into communities that are homogenous. But it feels like the entire world is now being sorted, and all the ideas in the world and all the symbols and products in the world are all being sorted, and you have to either be conservative or progressive. And if you identify with anything in the other category, you get destroyed. Like, I mean, the NFL suddenly has become political. I mean, the idea of race, which used to be just an assumption that racism existed and was a universally bad thing, and nobody wanted to be accused of being a racist. And if your institution finds that it has racism in its past, you want to kind of shine a light on that and deal with it. Now you can't do that without getting lambasted by the right. On the flip side, if you believe that male and female are actual biological genders that need to be on some level understood and respected in society, then you get lambasted by the left, right?
Don't say that. You'll never be able to write another Harry Potter book.
I know. So that's like, this is what's getting absurd is everything. There's no neutral ground anymore. Everything is either part of the blue team or the red team. And if you are ever caught dead flirting with something on the other team, you're canceled.
Yeah.
And it's becoming absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. So Beth Moore became an Anglican, left the SBC and became an Anglican, and is now being attacked for being an Anglican. So she was attacked for being a Southern Baptist, but not quite towing the party line from the most conservative parts of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now she's being attacked for not being a Southern Baptist. So that makes it a little hard to make life choices or to just have to, you're going to be attacked. And that's just the way it is. You also brought up, and these were major stories last year, the book Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumais, Cobes Dumais, and the book Making a Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr. Both were on the show talking about those books, and those books made quite a stir.
Yeah.
Significant noise was made by those books.
Yes. And for slightly different reasons, but related, for sure. Very related. They both deal a ton with gender. Obviously, Jesus and John Wayne was emphasizing the takeover of masculine ideas in a lot of American evangelicalism.
Masculinity in evangelical culture.
And the Making of Biblical Womanhood was as well, but kind of looking at it from the other point of view, which is counter to biblical masculinity, was also the rise of this biblical femininity. And Beth Allison Barr kind of uncovered all the weirdness of that. And for me, these two books and a lot of other voices, it felt, maybe my perspective is completely bonkers here, but it feels like the burden of proof has shifted a little bit, where within broader evangelicalism, it used to feel like if you were pro women in leadership, meaning if you were egalitarian, you had the burden of proof.
Right.
Like you had to justify that position.
Because obviously this year, the Bible says otherwise.
Right. This year, because of these books and the arguments that a lot of people are making, including N.T. Wright and many others, it feels a little bit to me like the burden of proof is shifting, where if you are going to advocate for a complementarian view, especially if it's a hyper-complementarian view, you now have the burden of proof and need to justify that position based on scripture. I could be wrong. I'm sure it's different in different communities, but if that's a vibe I'm getting.
Yeah. And I don't know if you watched Beth Allison Barr much on Twitter, but it's become clear that she did not expect the level of attack that she's fatigued. She is fatigued by the response to Making a Biblical Womanhood, and just the number of people, throwing furniture, throwing rocks at her head, and trying to discredit her credentials, trying to discredit her scholarship. And the same thing is true of Jesus and John Wayne, where you see these complaints coming out of, the kind of the hyper conservative circles of there's not enough Bible in these books. There's not enough Bible. These
Yeah.
aren't studies of the Bible, so we can discredit them. And Beth Allison Barr is the first to say, I'm a historian. I'm not, I'm telling you the history of how Christians have viewed women and their roles and how it's changed over the years. I'm not doing a Bible study.
Yeah, but even to be fair, I read that book, and there's a sizable amount of Bible in it. In Beth Allison Barr's book, especially, she tackles a lot of what the New Testament says about
she
women,
does.
and so it's not meant to be a theological examination of the issue from a New Testament point of view. But she does dabble in that because you have to do the history then. But it's almost predictable when someone comes forward with an idea or an article or a book which challenges the conventional white patriarchal conservative view of whatever. The attacks are going to be, it's not biblical enough. The attack is going to be, they have an agenda, they're feminist, they're woke, and rarely does it actually deal with the substance of the argument. And that's too bad, because I think the church overall would benefit greatly by having really rich theological, historical, biblical conversations around these issues.
Yeah.
And I think some people are, but they're certainly not the ones that get the most attention.
I don't understand. I mean, our church had a woman preach from the pulpit for the first time about 40 years ago. I was in high school, and several families walked out that Sunday because it was such a shock. But that was been 40 years. So we've been having women preach in a complementarian denomination. We've been allowing women to preach for 40 years, but I'm not sure why it's so threatening. Our dear Caitlin Chess just preached a sermon last Sunday at her parents' church and she set up just a pile of direct messages on Twitter of people saying, you're not supposed to do that. Why is it so threatening?
I think it's threatening because people have been told that this is a highly symbolic indicator that the church is abandoning the authority of Scripture. And you can't see it often in subtle ways, but if there's a woman in the pulpit, that's a clear indication that your church is abandoning the authority of Scripture, and it sets off the warning signs again. And that's why people freak out about it. It's not that they think a woman is incapable of teaching the Bible. They're worried this is an indicator that my church is going to slip into mainline moderate or progressive theology. And next thing you know, out goes the resurrection, out goes the inerrancy of Scripture, out goes, all these other doctrines. And this is where you have to draw the line. That's been my understanding as I've talked to people for the last 20 years and why they hold to complementarian views.
I've heard those same arguments about, the age of the earth.
Yeah.
That you have
it's a slippery slope
to this, right, or you start losing. So do we just do that with whatever our pet issue is?
Yeah.
This is it's believer's baptism. And if you baptize a baby, the next thing you don't believe in Jesus anymore.
Well, and to remember, Phil, in church history, there were literally wars fought over this kind of stuff. Infant baptism versus adult baptism.
Well, we're still fighting wars over it. We just do it on Twitter, so they're a little less bloody. It's psychological warfare. I'm going to send my grandson into this, and then it'll be biological warfare. Go kiss everyone who disagrees with me theologically.
He's just a little toddler time bomb. I remember in my undergrad studies of history, there was a massive church split, and I think it may have even gotten violent over the design of the communion table. Because I know it sounds strange, but and you can actually see this to this day. You go into most low church Protestant, say Baptist church types, and the communion table has legs. And there's a reason, because it's a table. Whereas if it didn't have legs, if it was a solid piece of wood, that looks like an altar, which is too Roman Catholic.
Oh, okay.
And would symbolize a whole different meaning to what's happening with the bread and the juice, right? So, I mean, there's always been something that people feel like this is it. This is the line we have to hold. If that table does not have legs, we are walking out of the church and we're going to fight tooth and nail if that table doesn't have legs. And now most of us never even think about that. Same thing with these other issues like age of the earth, women in the pulpit.
So it seems like we have a really big problem figuring out what the essentials are.
Yeah, well, generally, when you go back to the early church, some of those early creeds defined what the essentials were, like the Trinity and the fully man, fully God
we're
nature.
non-creedal. We're evangelicals. We're non-creedal, Skye.
Oh, yes, we are creedal.
We're totally non-creedal.
The problem is beyond those things, what is essential, I'm using air quotes, is defined by your culture and your circumstances.
Yes.
So
potlucks are essential.
Right.
Prayer chains are essential.
So if you were to pontificate about the future, Phil, what is a future non-essential that doesn't feel important now, but you think someday will be?
Oh, man. Drums. Some people want to get rid of drums and go back to just choral singing.
Okay.
That's going to be the end. I don't know. I don't. What's a future non-essential or a future essential that's currently a non-essential? Is that what you asked?
Right. Yeah.
It's currently a non-essential. What's the next thing that people are going to freak out about? Well, never. I don't know if we'll ever resolve the women thing. Can women use their gifts in the church, or do they need to go run Germany instead? I don't know if we'll ever get over that. But, next I assume is what role can, someone from the LGBTQ community play in a church, and what is the status that will determine that. Beyond that, I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's already an issue in many churches, but one that comes to mind, I don't know for sure, but I wonder if we will eventually see serious theological arguments around what can be digitized in the church and what has to be incarnate.
Oh, interesting.
I think that could be a future battleground.
Yes. Can my pastor, senior pastor, be an avatar?
Yeah.
Okay. The other story that you brought up that was big this year was the Mars Hill podcast. And it's immense. It was the #1 religion and spirituality podcast for quite a few weeks. So it's probably the most popular Christian podcast that really has ever been launched at this point. So why was it so popular? Is it just we love slowing down for car crashes to look at the wreckage on the side of the road? Why do you think it was so popular, and what do you make of it? And does it have anything to do with our theme this year of empires striking back or striking out?
Yes, I think it does. But a couple things. Number one, I don't want to diminish the role that Mike Cosper and his team have in making that so successful. I just think the work they did, the production value, the storytelling.
It was actually good. It was a good podcast.
It was good. Yeah,
okay.
It deserved to be highly downloaded and recognized. So I don't want to just brush that aside. But secondly, I think the real secret to that podcast success is not that Mars Hill or Mark Driscoll are that particular. I think it's actually the universal nature of the story. I think when a lot of us listen to that podcast, even though we weren't at that church, we recognized a lot of similarities with toxic church cultures that we have been a part of. And I think there's been a growing discontent for years. We had Josh Packard on just a few weeks ago. He's been on a couple of times now. I first encountered him through a book he co-authored called Church Refugees, which started documenting the phenomenon of very committed Christians abandoning their churches. Not their faith, but just their churches. And when I read that book back in, 2014, 15, something like that, it resonated with me. And it's something I've been hearing a lot from people. And it comes down to that toxic culture within so many church systems. And so many people have experienced that. And this podcast, better than any other before it, kind of gave you an extreme example of it. And even though it was extreme, there's so much in common with other people's experiences that they wanted to keep listening because it made them not feel alone or isolated or weird,
right?
For having that scar tissue from their own churches. So I think it's a much bigger indictment of where we are in American evangelicalism. It's not an indictment just of Mars Hill or Mark Driscoll.
Yeah. It is an informative piece just on the nature and the shadow side of celebrity culture.
Yeah.
When you build, but even seeing kind of the seduction of power in comparing the way Mark Driscoll talked about the church and talked about himself in the early years, and then how his self presentation and the storytelling changed over the years to be the story of the founding of Mars Hill Church by the end that he was telling was very different than the story he was telling at the very beginning, or even the actual story of how it started. So how we build, and that, man, I think that's a danger of anyone who does something successful, is the temptation to mythologize your own story. And particularly in an evangelical culture that loves testimony. We want it's Guidepost Magazine. It's something for Christian radio. It'll get you on Caleb. It'll get you on, Decision from Billy Graham Association. It's like, here's my story. I had nothing. I was nowhere. And then I heard the voice of God say, start that ministry, plant that church. And now look at me. And we all want to be the chosen one, because it was me and Big Idea. I was like, I think I'm the chosen one to save all of the world's children from evil. It's a big responsibility, but I think I'm up for it.
Yeah, I think that's a big chunk of it for sure. But the other part of the story, beyond the mythologizing and beginning to believe our own press, is the podcast for me was like it's the Wizard of Oz. It's this amazing Emerald City kind of world, but then you get a peek behind the curtain and you realize the person behind it all wasn't the great Oz. It's just this old man pulling string.
Just a guy.
So Mark built his whole ministry around this manhood idea that men need to grow up, take responsibility, be providers, be warriors, all this rhetoric, rah-rah, high testosterone crap. But then when he faced his own reckoning, and this came out really clearly in the final few episodes, rather than take responsibility, own up to it, deal with it as a man, he cut and run.
Yeah.
Which was, they looked behind the curtain and realized the guy who was the great Oz was not what he appeared to be.
Right.
And I think that is symbolic of what people are experiencing in American evangelicalism in general. American evangelicalism has presented itself as the answer to all the world's problems, all of the country's problems, all of your personal problems. If you just do it this way, everything will be fixed. And in the last number of years, we've gotten a glimpse behind the curtain and realized, oh my gosh, the white evangelical church is just rife with sexual abuse, racism, political expediency, the embrace of Trumpism, all. And you look behind the curtain, and I think a whole bunch of us are going, oh my gosh, this is, I've been sold a bill of goods. This is a load of crap, which leads to the whole deconstruction conversation, all that. And in a way, Mark Driscoll personifies the entire phenomenon in his own hypocrisy. And that is a whole nother layer to the brilliance of that podcast and why it resonates with so many of us.
So this leads me to, because Mark Driscoll didn't stop. He just got in a hot air balloon, left Oz, and started a new church somewhere
moved to
else.
Arizona.
Moved to Arizona, took his balloon to Arizona, set up again, found some new, I was going to say Oompa Loompas, but now I'm really crossing the streams. What were the people called that lived in Oz?
The
Ozians?
Oswalds?
I don't know what they were. So he's doing it again and just celebrated, his 5th anniversary of his new church. And he's never apologized for what he did to people in his old church. And yet people are like, hey, this guy's great. We love this guy. So who's, in my analogy, who's the empire in this? Is it the ideas of, I think what was most disturbing to me in the Mars Hill podcast was the list of prominent people who would not participate in the podcast.
Yeah.
Who would not, and it was people who had platformed Driscoll. It was Keller. It was Piper. It was Chandler. People.
This is the evangelical industrial complex.
I know, but it's like, I was so disappointed that, like, how do we learn anything? Because Tim Keller's a really good guy. I really like Tim Keller. And he helped platform Mark Driscoll. and to not be willing to sit down. Maybe he's done it in some other context. Maybe he's blogged about it or written about it.
To be fair to Tim Keller, he is dealing with stage 4 pancreatic cancer right now.
I know, but he's still active. He's still active. He's not that far out. He just tweeted a lovely picture of himself at Christmas, standing next to his Christmas tree,
fine.
And he looked good. I'm just wondering, Piper, Keller, Chandler, isn't that... even if you're trying to hang on, to protect the reputation of your neo-reformed movement, wouldn't it be good to come clean about, wow, I misjudged this guy. This is not what our movement represents.
I'm not saying this is true of all of those people, but in general, I think being a highly successful Christian celebrity in the EIC means never having to say you're sorry.
The EIC?
Yeah, Evangelical Industrial Complex.
I just wanted you to play that up for people.
Having to say you're sorry, that's not very biblical.
I know it's not biblical, but we see it we talked about the Trumpism thing and Don Jr. and we need to get rid of Jesus values here if we're going to win. And I think it's so rare that you have high profile Christian leaders who are caught in anything who really do a deep biblical sort of repentance. And I mean, some of these folks could have come out and said, hey, we were as duped as everyone else by Driscoll and regret what happened. But I've been around the EIC long enough and seen behind the curtain enough and know how it works enough that I know for a fact that there were people who saw Mark Driscoll's red flags and dysfunction and abusive behavior for years and didn't stop because he made them so much money. He drew people to conferences. He sold books. He got the radio programs going. I mean, he was a golden goose, and that's how the system works, sadly.
Can non-sanctified people build ministries faster than sanctified people?
Generally, yes.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, and that's the part that I think people don't pay attention to enough. Like we talked about this a little bit with the Bill Hybels story a few years ago. A lot of people lamented his downfall and felt like how do you reconcile the fact that this guy built such a huge ministry that impacted so many millions of lives and yet had this shadow side to him? Not just the sexual abuse stuff, but the toxic narcissistic dynamic that happened within the leadership structures of that church that Scott McKnight and his daughter have written about in their book, A Church Called Tove. And what a lot of people don't realize is that narcissistic personality and those dynamics that everyone sees as a dark, sinful side are actually part of what made him so successful as a mega church leader. And you can't take one side of it and not accept the other.
Yeah.
So the very qualities that we lament about some of these leaders are the very qualities that have made them so successful in the first place. And we have to be willing to look at that and ask ourselves, how are we responsible for elevating these people because we're so impressed with some of their gifts and abilities, but we don't want to look at the dark side of it.
Right. Okay. Last question then. Next year, 2022. Is it still The Empire Strikes Back, or is it Return of the Jedi? When do we get to Return of the Jedi? And now that, so many elder statesmen like Dallas Willards and Eugene Petersons are gone, who the heck is the Jedi that's going to return?
Who's the Yoda?
Who's the Yoda? Yeah, a friend
that can
of mine
train
said,
the young Luke.
Yeah. A friend of mine said years ago, the problem is our generation, the next generation wants to be a Jedi, and our generation has failed to produce a Yoda. So because there's a lot of dissatisfaction. The whole deconstruction movement is based on dissatisfaction with the empire, with the industrial complex, with the status quo. The status quo always fights to sustain itself. No status quo has ever willingly given up. So there's a battle there against the status quo. How long a battle is this? What's 2022 going to look like, Skye?
Well, I think the battle continues. I don't think it's going to be done. And the battle, to give some definition to it, I guess there's different ways you categorize this, but I kind of have landed on it's a battle between classical evangelicals and cultural evangelicals. And I don't see that going away. The question is, for the classical evangelicals, what are they going to do on the issue of marriage and sexuality? Because that's still out. We'll see what happens, if anything, in 2022. And on the cultural evangelical side, what, if anything, are they going to do when and if Donald Trump is no longer a political player? So that those questions, I think, could be factors in 22. But I think if there's a Jedi component to this, if there's a Return of the Jedi component, I wonder if it'll start subtly and slowly, but will we see a growing interest in new forms of church and ministry? Yeah. Are we finally going to wean off of our infatuation with mega church and mega ministries and celebrity pastors a little bit and begin experimenting with new models or house church movements or other things that would be a correction to the empires that we've built up to this point?
Right. Do you know what we need to make it the war end faster? We need some really charismatic leaders.
Of course.
Really good at attracting crowds.
Uh-huh.
So what are we in this story? Are we Ewoks, Skye? Are we the fuzzy little guys that's like, oh, wow, they're nice. And whose side are they on? Oh, they're fighting for the rebellion, fighting for the truth. And they're fuzzy.
You like that idea?
Yeah, I think I'm an Ewok.
What if we're like the droids? What if we're like C-3PO and R2?
We don't have minds of our own?
Well, they do. They have minds of their own.
Yeah, they're just programmed. They've just been programmed. Okay, what do you guys think 2022 is going to be like? Is it more of the same? I mean, we have a midterm in it, which means that, Trump and the Trumplets are going to be running around talking crazy in churches and posing with guns and Bibles. And so that's probably going to be a lot of gun and Bible photo ops in 2022 for the midterms. So I think there'll be more events and cultural moments that kind of create distinction between cultural evangelicalism and classical or orthodox evangelicalism. The question is, how many more years do we have of just looking really silly? Did you see the new movie came out, the new Adam McKay movie, Don't Look Up?
I haven't seen it.
With everybody. It just came out on Netflix and in theaters. It's worth watching. It's kind of a climate change parable, but it's two scientists played by Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, two Michigan State scientists that discover a comet, a very large comet, headed directly for Earth, and then go to the White House to tell the president about it, who's Meryl Streep playing, and Jonah Hill as her son and chief of staff. So playing kind of a Trump family in the White House and trying to get people's attention. Like, something bad is about to happen. Something bad is about to happen. We need to do something. And no one really wants to change the status quo to save the world. So it's a climate change parable. But Timothy Chalamet plays a skateboard punk in rural Michigan that Jennifer Lawrence bumps into. And it's interesting because he's smoking and doing drugs and whatever. But then they talk about God, and Jennifer Lawrence astonishingly says, wait, you believe in God? And he said, I thought this was the statement of Hollywood for 2021. He said, yes, my parents raised me evangelical. It doesn't say raised me Christian. It didn't say raised me Baptist. It said raised me evangelical. And I thought, no 20-year-old kid has ever said, my parents raised me evangelical, because no parents have said to their kids, I'm going to raise you evangelical. They say, I'm going to raise you. So I just thought it was interesting that this is everything that's happened over the last 4 years and all this talk about the evangelicals. Hollywood has figured out, oh, there's kids out there that are being raised evangelical and are rethinking it. Let's put Timothy Chalamet in a movie and have him be one of these. I thought it was kind of interesting. But then it gets to the very end and he says a prayer, because everyone else, of course, in the movie is secular, because only about 1 in 20 people believe in God in America. It's an astonishingly low figure in the movies. So they're looking at mortality in the face, and they ask him to pray, and he actually prays a wonderful prayer that doesn't sound at all evangelical. It's much more kind of Anglican and very, very thoughtful. It's like, so wow, you just amalgamated a whole bunch of stuff together, came up with a great prayer. Kudos to that. That does not have its roots in what he would have experienced from parents who said, we're going to raise you evangelical the right way. Fascinating, but it's really funny movie. Go watch it and you'll like it. I'm endorsing it.
Why did we talk about that?
Because Timothy Chalamet saying, my parents raised me evangelical, just struck me as where we are as a culture, where Hollywood sees the world as secular people and evangelicals.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're getting at there is the war that's emerged is, will evangelicals continue to fight, or at least the cultural evangelicals continue to fight for hegemony? Like they want the whole thing for themselves, or will they ever come to a place like I hope the classical evangelicals have of saying, we are okay sharing this world, sharing this country with people that don't believe the same way we do.
Yeah.
And we can figure it out. That's the battle.
Can we think we can resolve that in 2022? Just
no, but
once
I mean,
and for all?
Demographics are going to resolve that in time, no matter what. It's just you're seeing the death throes of the one side that can't handle the future.
Okay. All right. We have a special today. You are sitting down with, who did you sit down with? Kinnaman?
David Kinnaman.
David Kinnaman, president of Barna Research, to talk Barna Briefs. We have a new segment called Barna Briefs, where we go through David Kinnaman's shorts and see what's going on in the world of research. And there's no better place to find it than in David Kinnaman's shorts. Okay.
Right. Because every segment on the show has to be in some way butt themed.
French Fridays. French Fridays?
No, well, that's not in this show. That's a separate show.
Oh, that's a separate show. Okay. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening in.
Right.
Have a great end of your year. We'll be back with you in 2022 to see, hopefully within the first couple of weeks, our predictions will be resolved as to whether we've dismantled the evangelical industrial complex, whether we're in Empire Strikes Back Part 2, or whether it's time to meet some Ewoks. I really hope 2022 is when it's time to meet some Ewoks. And maybe by 2023, we're doing that crazy Ewok dance at the end. You think?
We can hope.
Because it kind of looks like you're broadcasting from inside the Death Star. I hate to tell you that.
No,
with Rembrandt on the wall.
Yeah, it's too warm for that. All right, everyone.
Okay. See you next time.
We're almost 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's clearly taking a toll on churches and church leaders. The Barna Group has recently completed their annual State of the Church report, and my friend David Kinnaman, the president of Barna, is here to talk about it. This is the first of a new reoccurring segment on the Holy Post featuring data from Barna, and at the end of this interview, you'll hear how you can get access to some new Barna reports for free as a Holy Post listener. Okay, here is David Kinnaman.
Since you like data, thought we would create a segment here to share with trends from everywhere. It's David Kinnaman and his Barna Briefs.
One size fits all, not available in California.
David Kinnaman, welcome back to the Holy Post.
How's it going, Skye? Good to see you.
This is the first of what we're hoping is going to be a reoccurring series of reports from you guys over at Barna that we're calling Barna Briefs. And we are excited that you are unveiling part of a new research project called the State of the Church and Faith in 2021. Tell us a little bit about the scope of this whole project.
Well, first, I can only imagine what Phil and his song making will do with the Barna Briefs branding. And sort of researchers in their underwear is sort of where I'm going with that.
Yeah, it's sort of adjacent to news of the butt. We're keeping it all in that vicinity. So, and alliteration helps. Barna Briefs.
Yeah. Well,
it's like French Friday.
Let's be brought to you by SpongeBob SquarePants. So, we've been working obviously for almost 4 decades now as a company on state of the church and what's happening in the world, and using the very best of social research that we can muster to help Christians understand and broader cultural leaders and observers understand what's happening. So, State of the Church 2021 is an effort. It started, we've been doing State of the Church forever, but we started at 2020, a big effort before COVID to really understand where was the church, what was happening. And then just a few months in, of course, you might have heard of the pandemic. And so I think we've been recalibrating and working on things that look at both the health of pastors, issues of mental and emotional health in our society, what has happened and is happening to the church and local churches and church attendance and committedness to local congregations. How do people engage? People were already edging towards this sort of consumerist mindset of, a really active person would come 1.7 times a month and say they were a dedicated churchgoer. So I think we're really trying to keep our finger on the pulse of a lot of things, but those are some of the main things we'd love to talk about.
Yeah. So one of the trends that we all faced was when the pandemic hit, churches were scrambling to figure out how do we remain engaged with our congregants without having them physically present in the building. A lot of places moved to online services, streaming in various platforms. And there was speculation, is this like the new normal? Even after the pandemic, are we going to stay with this streaming, decentralized, disincarnate kind of church? So some of the data you uncovered revealed, what do people actually feel about digital church or streaming services versus being in person? What did you find there? Is there a lasting impact of this pandemic in the way we do things?
There will absolutely be a lasting impact, and there's a couple different ways of looking at that. So first, as the pandemic began, and in the summer of 2020, we found that 32% of practicing Christians said that they stopped attending church during the pandemic. Now, some of them have come back, but 35% were still and only attending their pre-COVID church. 14% had switched churches from the pre-COVID church, and 18% were viewing multiple churches, throughout the sort of the previous month from the survey. So, a huge kind of winnowing, leveling out, sifting of the wheat from the chaff, you might say, of people that were sort of willing to do digital church, people that weren't. I've come to sort of observe about this moment that, we've talked a lot about, even on this podcast and in other places. Barna has sort of shown that Christianity is sort of a mile wide but an inch deep in America, and I think a lot of shifting and sifting has happened. You might remember this sort of dating advice that people often say, like, she's just not that into you. I think pastors.
I've never heard that. It's never been spoken to me. I don't know what you mean.
Well, fair enough. But this idea that pastors, I think the realization that, people in our congregations just aren't that into us as we imagined. And the pandemic sort of reminded us that, they're not returning our phone calls and texts. And there's a sense of that being one of the lasting impacts of the pandemic.
I know this is anecdotal and may not correlate with your data, which is, real data. But one of the things that surprised me is the number of conversations I've had with Christians of all ages, not just young adults, but people of my parents' generation, right, in their 60s and 70s, for whom the pandemic sort of broke the inertia, the momentum of the rhythm of going to church every Sunday. And now they're saying things like, I've been discontent there for years and years and years. And I didn't have a good reason to stop or a break in the habit. And I'm finding lifelong church-going, conservative, evangelical, theologically grounded Christians who are just like, I don't get the system anymore. I'm out. I'm done. And it feels like COVID was the thing that pushed them over. Is that backed up by some of your data?
I think absolutely. And I think further to the point that you're making, early on in the pandemic, within the first 4 or 5 weeks, a friend of mine, Carrie Newhoff, and I started this podcast called Church Pulse Weekly about 10 days after the pandemic started, to try to help church leaders know what was going on and keep tabs with other leaders. And we started talking, in my social research 25 said, I feel like we've been practicing 25 years to be social researchers in a time of a pandemic, because it was so no one was having fun, but it was sure interesting to be able to track public opinion and all of these, massive changes in the span of just a few weeks. And I said that I thought there'd be a long long impact, a long shadow, what I call the habit forming nature of staying away from church physically.
Mm-hmm.
And then the long psychological impact that I think this is going to have on how especially young people think about jobs and education, even kids think about kids who've never now really known a period of time when, the muscle memory of mask wearing and mandates and social distancing. So I think this idea of a habit forming, experience and, participating in the church is so essential to our spiritual well-being. But this is something George Barna, the founder of Barna Group, has written about and talked about for a long time, that people's spiritual expression, input and output, the church could be much larger than the way we sort of think about it as one, being part of one congregation week in and week out. Now it's certainly being a part of a Christian community more than week in and week out, like on a daily, hourly basis, like we're part of this broader body of Christ and his work in the world. But anyway, I think there's a real sense in which this disruption, for many very deep, committed believers, has sort of reminded them that there's parts about the structure of congregational life in America that just wasn't quite working. It might be an old wineskin, or there might be elements of this that are up for reinvention, rethinking as we're heading into this sort of new era. I was thinking, I know there's plenty of good theologians that could parse the data differently than I would. I'm just a social researcher and son of a pastor. But when Jesus was asked, where should good believers worship, and he said, the time is coming and now is when it really won't matter, where you worship, in physical or digital or here or there or on Sundays or whatever, but you worship in spirit and truth. And I think the question for church leaders, for all of us, could be, are we worshiping the Lord today with a greater sense of spirit and truth, a deeper sense of what God's doing in the world? And I think that would be, such a refining part of what we could ask ourselves and leaders. Are our congregations contributing to people not just showing up? Hey, showing up is great. It's more important than ever. Not just clicking on a digital stream. Hey, clicking on a digital stream is important, more important than ever. But are we worshiping? Are we facilitating worship that enables people to worship the Lord in spirit and truth?
Yeah. Okay. So that raises another question I have about sort of the congregants, the members who are walking away. Are we seeing evidence that streaming services and making them accessible to people on digital platforms is a lasting alternative? Is this are people who are leaving because they don't like getting up and physically gathering at a church facility like they used to? Or is there something else going on here? Is it, whether it's streaming or live in person, there's something more fundamental that they're reacting against, and just throwing it up on a digital stream is not going to keep them engaged?
Well, it's a great question. I don't know how to answer that. I'll just go back to this observation, and more than observation, sort of this deep-rooted research finding from the last few years that the activities of local churches are really, they're really insufficient to do the job of formation that I think we've tasked them to do. So, pick your metaphor, but let's say we're trying to, bail water from a ship, and you've got a tiny little plastic cup, which is I'm holding here for those of you watching on video, and it's like, you're bailing water as quickly as you can out of a massive ship, and it's just insufficient to bail the absolute gallons and gallons and gallons of water that are coming over the side of the ship every day. And that's just a little bit of a metaphor of the amount of content that we're swimming in as individuals, and then using the church, like Sunday morning worship, every 3 weeks. And it's just like, you got a tiny cup of cold water to be able to throw over the side. So another framework that we've talked about is like that we're doing what I call dial-up ministry in a Wi-Fi world. That the sheer force of the pressures that we face now, and I've heard Andy Crouch observe this, that schools and education, that churches and houses of worship, and that families and households are less sufficient today. Their structures, even though God has still ordained them and they're important and they're still doing, incredible work, they're less sufficient today to form human beings in the ways that we hope they would, as far as spiritually grounded, relationally healthy and whole, and sort of able to take on the world. And what's happening is that entertainment, social media, technology, there's this sort of grand experiment that's happening behind the scenes, even business and enterprise and government and politics. There's this real sense in which we don't have the tools now within education, public, private, either way. It's like even educators are struggling in ways to know how to educate. Teachers and pastors are struggling. How do we really form disciples? Parents are like, how do we raise young people of meaning and conscience and character? And I think that's just like so par for the course. I've called this digital Babylon, where the power of our screens, the power of these algorithms under the surface, the power of our expectations are sort of they're showing how irrelevant the model is. And I'm just convinced that we are at a sea change moment where we need new models. We need to figure out how to re-engineer or reimagine faith communities that can have bigger cups to bigger like a whole like a generator with something that can bail our ship, or like have a different kind of ship to sail through these moments of life. And so I think these are kind of crazy broad statements, but I just feel like we're at a really important moment for individuals and for each of us, whether we're students, whether students or educators, whether we're pastors or congregants, whether we're parents or children, or grandparents. Like we're all trying to figure out what could be next when it comes to these sort of shaping influence. And again, not to get too wonky, but the power of institutions are more important than ever, and there's never been a more important time when we reimagine the role of those institutions in our lives and how they could be built for better effectiveness.
Okay, let's stay with your metaphor of the ship that's taking on water, and we're sitting there with a plastic cup trying to bail it out and getting frustrated. Your data found some interesting stuff on the other side of the equation regarding pastors and their burnout rate. And I wonder if you can share the numbers with us in a second, but I wonder if the burnout that we're seeing among church leaders is coming from this phenomenon that you're talking about. They recognize that they have insufficient tools to accomplish the work they've been called to do. And over time, they're flaming out and burning out as a result. What did your survey tell us about the state of pastors?
Well, we just completed the survey about a week ago, and it was alarm bells were going off. You could call it a growing crisis among pastors. And what we found is that 2 in 5 pastors, 38%, said that they'd given real and serious consideration to quitting full-time ministry within the last year. And that number, that was October data, October 2021, that number had grown from 29% in January of 2021. So just a real significant increase. And younger pastors, pastors under 45, 46% said that they had given real serious consideration to quitting. So it's not just like these are older pastors who are like, what the heck just happened, but this is younger pastors too, or maybe especially. And
did your data identify what in particular had brought them to that point?
No, it had not. We hope to do more research on that in the coming months, but for mostly reasons of just budget and timing, we didn't look at it. We didn't have the money, we didn't have the resources, we didn't have the ability we were just doing kind of a temperature check and didn't expect the number to have grown as much as it was. And
we can certainly speculate in the last year what's occurred that's increased their stress and desire to get out, but it would be fascinating to get the detail for sure.
Yeah. And we hope to do that.
What are you hearing anecdotally from pastors? I mean, I've had a number of people interact with me in the last year who are in ministry talking about not just leaving their church, but leaving ministry altogether. And I mean, one story, a pastor reached out to me and He's about my age, your age. We're similar in age. And I asked him, why'd you get into ministry in the first place? And he said, because I honestly believe that the church, the local church, is the hope of the world, which is kind of a cliche that was pretty popular in the 90s, early 2000s. And I asked him, what's changed? And he said, when I look at what's going on in my congregation, the fighting, the disunity, the conspiracy theories, the political nonsense, the anti-vax stuff that's going on. He said, I meet people out in my community who aren't Christians and don't attend church. And sometimes I honestly think that their life would be worse if they came to my church.
Mm.
And he said, I don't know how to lead an institution that's making people's lives worse rather than better.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's just one story, but it encapsulates somebody who got into ministry, I think, for the right reasons and is leaving perhaps totally disillusioned by what's happened in the last couple of years. Does that fit with any experiences or interactions you've had with pastors, or are you hearing like a different side of this or a different explanation? I'm not asking you to, this isn't data driven, obviously, but it's anecdotal. Sure. But what are you picking up just in your interactions?
Yeah, I think it's consistent with some of the things we're hearing, that there's this deep soul searching for many leaders, and that's happening across a lot of sectors, isn't it? You know, if you're operating cinema and theater and in-person gatherings, you know, you're wondering what's going to be next and how do we reinvent our model. I'd heard one leader, a senior leader in Nashville, talk about the fact that he'd heard from, I don't know, 70-80% of his peers in ministry, and not like small podunk churches, but mid-sized, large leaders of large, mid-sized churches, mid-sized to large churches that were, you know, desiring to quit. So I think we've got, you know, kind of like I said, a growing, if not full-blown crisis on our hands. And this idea, again, we don't have a lot of good data as to, you know, what are some of the underlying reasons, but there certainly has to be some sense that leaders are seeing that the model is inadequate to the task. And you know, certainly that's my strong conviction. I bet my house on that, in terms of just the sheer volume of data that we've collected and what it means then to form people. You know, Jesus gives us these ideas of, you know, loving God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you know, really our formational tools just don't go as deep as they need to. So we need different and better sets of tools in this era when all these other institutions and sources of power are influencing, you know, people's hearts and minds.
Is the silver lining in this data that it seems to be an increasing number of church members are realizing that the model is insufficient and they're leaving it, but there's also an increasing number of church leaders who are recognizing the model is insufficient and they're considering leaving it? Like,
yeah, I think so.
We're largely in agreement that this isn't working anymore, but we need innovation and new models. So hopefully we see that emerging perhaps on the periphery at the margins, and you guys can begin to show us what that could look like. Final comments or data that you want to drop on us before we have to wrap up this brief Barna Brief?
Well, I think that mental health and the challenges of the emotional impact, again, early on in March and April of 2020, we started seeing in the data, we started predicting that there would be, you know, a big emotional mental health toll. And that's certainly been the case for pastors, as we've talked about, but also for congregants. We found some really remarkable data. I mean, first of all, there's the problems. Nearly 1 in 4 U.S. adults reported feeling lonely at least weekly. The level of severity of that loneliness can be excruciating and almost unbearable for people. Barna has this new book out called The Loneliness Epidemic, which I would, you know, recommend to you on some of that. Like, how do we as the church understand and show up for the lonely? And you know, many of us have experienced that. And then there's all these other places, you know, the mental and emotional health strains on millennials, on Gen Z has been profound. The good news there is that millennials and Gen Z have a language of mental health and awareness of that I think older adults don't have the same proficiency with. And I think that's a really good thing, that there's like a language and some hope to be offered there. And furthermore, there's some really good news when we found that 4 in 5 church Christians said they'd be interested in Christian churches in their community offering preaching and programming that would address mental and emotional health and relational well-being. And so there's this sense in which, and even unchurched people, it was nearly half who said they were interested in Christian churches offering those kinds of preaching and programming opportunities. And I really think the church has an incredible opportunity to step into that. Now we have to be really careful not to pretend to be experts in places where that can be really dangerous to people, whether they're, suicide, certain kinds of depression, certain kinds of mental health issues need real professional help. But the church can be a resourcer and a conduit for the kind of help that I think people are just absolutely desperate for in a time of, putting people back together. I think there's going to be this sort of tsunami of grief and loss and mental health that over the next number of years is going to play itself out. And what better opportunity for the church to show up with hope in Christ.
I know some of the data you were posting before the pandemic showed these increased trends in loneliness and mental health. And I can't imagine what the pandemic has done to people who are already perhaps struggling with that, or increasingly young people who are coming of age in a time, which is stressful all by itself, but coming to age in a time of the pandemic. It's a reminder that all of us in church leadership, even if we're not experts in these areas, we need to become conversant in them, and certainly allocate resources and help people find the help they need. So great reminder that this is an area, not just that the culture is looking for the church to lead, but one in which our commitment to loving our neighbors calls and demands that we lead. Before you go, I'm happy to report that you guys are making an exclusive offer to the Holy Post audience. You are going to make available a free digital copy of one of Barna's recent journals to everybody listening. It's called 6 Questions About the Future of the Hybrid Church Experience. Okay, before we tell people where to go to get that, what are they going to find in that journal?
Well, probably answers to all of your questions in life. We could have called it Man's Search for Meaning, but Viktor Frankl took that, and it's fine. It's actually based on some research that we had done in 2020, looking at attitudes and perspectives towards digital and hybrid church. We found some remarkable things that people, actually still prefer physical gatherings, but there's this growing appetite for either primarily digital or both physical and digital expressions. So it really helps you parse, I think, as a leader, what's up and what's happening. And it's our pleasure to make it exclusive for you as a download. So 6 questions about the hybrid church, 6 questions about the future of the hybrid church experience. And you can go to barna.com/holypost to download that.
Right. So if you're a church leader, or you're a lay leader in your church, or you're just questioning what's the future hold between physical gatherings, digital use, and tools in the church, you're going to want this. 6 questions about the future of the hybrid church experience, barna.com/holypost. David, thanks for joining us. And we look forward to having you back for another Barna Brief.
Awesome. Can't wait. Thanks so much for having me.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.